So I'm very pleased to be introducing our next speaker, Heather Hargraves. I bumped into her at another conference in Vancouver a year or two ago and was very impressed. She's doing some fantastic work. Heather is, she has an MA as a trauma therapist and researcher in London, Ontario, Canada. Heather specializes in the use of neuro and biofeedback technologies to support a broad range of neurologically and or psychologically traumatized clients within her clinical practice. Her talk today is titled Nurturing Awareness, Neurofeedback and Psychedelics. Welcome, Heather. Delighted to have you with us.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be here. I'm honored to be sharing with everyone, and thank you guys for all the added effort that went into putting this conference online. I am just going to share my slides. So as Stephen said, I am going to be presenting on nurturing awareness using neurofeedback and psychedelics. And I think it's really lovely that we just came through that theta entrainment, because that's actually a place that I like to utilize in therapy, and a state that I'm often trying to cultivate when I'm working with clients. And so I'd like to take you guys on a little journey using that for a bit of state shifting under the umbrella of neuro meditation. And then as we go, I'm hoping that we'll unpack what we're doing here and even lend some insight into what you were just doing with that theta entrainment. So I'd just like to ask everyone to just take a moment, feel your feet on the floor, feel your body in your chair, and perhaps close your eyes or have a downward gaze or somewhere to hone your attention. And if you like, you can bring your hands and place them over your heart. And just start to become aware of the rhythm of your heart. And using your inner awareness, that inner guide, your attention and your intention, I'd like you to bring yourself into a garden of your choosing, space that your nervous system feels nourished by. And in that garden, I would like you to bring your awareness to one flower. And when we hold our awareness on one flower, we are focusing our attention. This is one form of neuromeditation. Just see what it's like to hold your attention there. I'm going to ask you to broaden your space, to broaden your mind, and to take in the entire garden. Notice if there's some bunnies, notice the sun, notice the different colors, but don't let your mind stop. Let your eyes and your awareness be open. Sounds you may be hearing, things you may be feeling in this space. And we've moved into mindfulness or open monitoring. Now let's imagine that the night has fallen upon us and you're standing in this garden at night. And you're aware that the garden is still there, but the darkness is pervasive. And now you're just left with this sense of space or emptiness. And now we've moved into a quiet mind state. And then coming back to some of the brightness of the garden, coming back to a sunlit day. See if you can bring your awareness to what it is like to smell the fragrance of this garden and the way it feels, noticing the visceral, somatic, embodied response you have to your favorite fragrance, or to noticing some baby bunnies, the way they feel when you see them, that tingle inside your body. Now you've moved into a state of loving kindness, a somatic awareness. And throughout this presentation and this weekend, I encourage you to kind of play with those states. Are you observing all things? Are you focused on one thing? Are you quiet inside? Or are you sitting in embodied kindness and care? Just check in and notice. So, as a neurofeedback therapist, I tend to put sensors on people's heads, and through the computer and these sensors, I record their brainwaves. And then as they shift their state, so as they would go through that exercise of moving their attention in different ways, this actually engages and activates different networks in the brain, which are then kind of represented by different frequencies in the brain. And so I use the computer to highlight the relationship the person is having with their own neuroanatomy to make them a little more clear of what state they are in. And I really like this quote because I feel that it's a nice tone to begin with. And it kind of encompasses what it means to work from a rhythmic kind of medicine approach, which I see neurofeedback as being tied to. There will come a time when a diseased condition will not be described as it is today by the physicians and the psychologists, but it will be spoken of in musical terms, as one would speak of a piano that was out of tune. And what I like about this quote and what I really enjoy about working as a neurofeedback therapist is that it also encompasses neurodiversity. So I don't look at clients ever as if they fit into a diagnostic category. I don't look at them as if they are broken or damaged in some way. I see the nervous system as an instrument that needs to be attuned to its environment. And if it's out of tune, I want to understand the reason why it got out of tune, because there's almost always a reason. And it's not that it's broken, it's that it was doing its best to adapt. And usually if it's struggling to adapt, it's because it had gone through very difficult, challenging, or really unstable situations that made adaptation difficult. So one way of considering reframing how we even look at mental health or look at how psychedelics affect different mental health categories is to kind of shift in a way that's closer to traditional medicine or frequency medicine. And the way we're doing that in the neurofeedback community has been led by a bright light in the neurofeedback community. Is an image of him here. It's Jay Gunkelman. He's a very experienced practitioner and mentor. And he started discovering these EEG phenotypes. So I'm just going to read this nice paragraph that I feel really clarifies what I mean by this. And you can find more at this website and just looking at EEG phenotypes in general online. But identifying subtypes of specific disorders is an attractive exercise as it expands our understanding of the individual's response to therapy. But it remains attached to the approach based on the DSM, which is rooted in behavior and frequently does not predict therapeutic response by any individual within the DSM group. Phenotypes, however, are an intermediate step between genetics and behavior. These proposed EEG phenotypes are semi-stable states of neurophysiological function. The author proposes a framework allowing one to describe much of the observed EEG variants within a small number of phenotypical categories. These groupings cut across the DMN categories, and unlike the DSM, the phenotypes predict the individual's response to therapy for neurofeedback as well as for medication. So what I'm proposing here today is that we start considering adding to some of our understanding of psychedelics, some of our trainings of therapists, and ways of working with our patients, these brain-computer interfaces that can allow us objective measures of relationship with shifting of states. So we can use neurofeedback to attune our embodied awareness, highlighting and cultivating deeper harmonic relationships with self and other. And one study that if you guys really want to have a fun look into some of the neurofeedback research is, again, Dr. Gunkelman had done this research where they put a medicine man and his client in another room, like separate rooms from one another. And what they found is that as the medicine man started to do his work, his frequencies started to enter into this rhythmic pattern. And, rhythm and music is a whole area that is used in healing that I'm not going to completely get into today, but focus more on the EEG. But you can see that as time went on, the medicine man's work started to synchronize with his client. And this has been reported in over the years. There was another neurofeedback therapist, Anna Wise, who discovered and demonstrated this a lot. And I think it could be very interesting to start measuring what's happening between a guide and someone under psychedelics or under a state of medicine work, and to see what's happening in the relationship between the brainwaves, which indicates what's happening in the relationship between the nervous systems. So these brain waves kind of fall on slow to fast, so delta all the way up to high beta. And if you kind of imagine them like a orchestra or a symphony or a group of a choir, it's maybe the easiest way to understand how these notes hang together. And then when we get gamma frequencies, these high fast frequencies, that's usually a sign of overall harmony or overall engagement in the nervous system. So as a neurofeedback therapist, as I said, that I use these brain-computer interfaces to give people feedback. But what is it that I'm giving them feedback with, and how am I doing that? So feedback usually occurs in my office anyway. There might be some other ways of doing it, but primarily through music, the music getting louder when somebody is reaching a reward. Haptics, there's a vibration that will be sent into the person using different stuffed animals or back pads, or visual, where you'll have a screen that's dimming, or games in which you start to win the race when you're achieving a certain goal. So if we have a choir and we want the choir to learn harmony, we have to give the choir feedback. Traditionally, you could record them, or there would be a conductor. And in the neurofeedback paradigm, it's these 3 feedback modalities. I'm usually either saying, this brain wave, this neural network, I want to see it get a little bit stronger. And when I want to see it get a little bit stronger, it's kind of like I set a bar, it's called a threshold. And then when somebody's frequencies go above that bar, they get a reward. Sometimes we want to quiet things. Things are too loud. So when we want to do that, we set a bar, and then it's more like a limbo bar. And the client only gets a reward when they're under the limbo bar. And so again, this emphasis on deepening relationships, how neurofeedback and even psychedelic states are deepening the relationship we have with our own nervous system, our own awareness of what state we're in, and then how that affects our relationships. And so Carl Rogers, father of Therapeutic Alliance, he said, in my early professional years, I was asking the question, how can I treat or cure or change this person? Now I would phrase the question in this way: how can I provide a relationship which this person may use for his own personal growth? So again, not focusing on a disorder, but more about where did the relationship become confused and how do we soothe that relationship so that that person can achieve resiliency again. So I've just talked to you briefly about the choir and the brain waves, and I'm just going to very quickly go over these states, and these brain waves are actually attached to the development of our psyche over time. So delta waves are mostly honed with the brainstem, and that's everything from conception all the way up into the age of 3. So those early experiences groom and set the tone of your overall fight, flight, freeze response. Theta waves come in when a child is starting to individuate and get a sense of self, and now they've got an emotional tone. It's not just an approach avoid behavior. It's actually, how do I kind of feel about that? And how am I relating to my caregivers? When do I reach? When do I settle down? And that's around to the age of 7, all the way up to 10. And then you see this alpha frequency, which is mainly driven by the thalamus. And now the thalamus is the relay station between our subconscious, and you'll see here in the corner that little image alpha, we call this the alpha bridge, and our conscious mind. So 50% of the alpha frequency comes from our embodied cognition that was built through our childhood, and then it's set. It's the rhythm section of the brain, and the rhythm section of our nervous system around the age of 10. And then the rest comes from the cortex. So beta frequencies, everything from slower beta, which is like a calm engagement, all the way up to fast beta, which can be stress and anxiety. And then gamma waves, again, is that sign that you know something, that you deeply understand something. When a musician is listening to music that they know really well, they'll show a lot of gamma. When a meditator is practicing in a way that they're really attuned to, they'll show gamma. It means binding. And we often, there's a lot of ideas of reaching higher states and becoming vibrating faster. But we need to remember that you can only reach that vibrational state when it's an integrated state. It's not an escape, it's actually a wholeness. So if we look at these as Russian nesting dolls, you have to be able to stack them and then for them to surrender to themselves through full connection and awareness and relationship to achieve this gamma state. So flow states are often seen as theta and alpha enveloped inside of gamma itself. So coming back to this concept of the alpha bridge, what I will see is that individuals tend to idle in faster frequencies or slower frequencies. Some of us are more comfortable going into like deep trancey states, and some are more comfortable being up in the more cognitive world. But the alpha bridge is a really important piece because alpha is that mediator between conscious mind and subconscious. And from a therapeutic perspective, I'm always trying to work with my clients to build an alpha bridge. I want them to be able to sit in the center of themselves, to recognize their sensory clarity, bring them into felt sense, but with a cognitive element. I had a supervisor describe alpha as sitting and watching a sunset and not sleeping, but being fully present and in the moment. And this can be a really powerful starting point for therapy because we want to know, do we want a client to come up or do we want a client to be able to come down? Are they someone who ruminates a lot or are they someone who avoids a lot? And getting that sense, it's a different path to come up. But in the end, the goal is that you want to be able to take your embodied cognition and like an infinity loop, bring it up into consciousness, and then bring it back down into the embodied self. And they work together, they inform one another, and then we relate to the world from a place of embodied cognition, not from a predictive place and a controlling place, and not from an avoiding or dissociative place, but from a fully integrated, aware place. I had pleasure once of having a nice dialogue with Shinzen Young at another one of these conferences online earlier this year. And we were talking about some of this idea with neurofeedback. And he said to me, wow, what's the difference between the fire that burns and the fire that warms? And I thought that was such a beautiful way of highlighting this relational piece. So if we imagine the cross in the middle is like our alpha frequency, just our middle ground, what is it? What is that difference? Why is excitement in the nervous system pleasant for some people and yet unpleasant for others? What is the difference between a cool state or a quiet state, where some will predict or see that as a frozen feeling, and others will see that as, invigorating? And again, it's that relationship with how your psyche was developed and the relationship you have with the states that you go through. So one of the things that we know in neurofeedback that I have to be very careful with, or anyone really working in therapy, is that if the nervous system has become fixed in some way, the relational pattern, they're more reactive than responsive. When we start bringing flexibility back into the system, you can come across something called relaxation-induced anxiety. So the nervous system and even the brain get used to traveling at a certain speed. And say a speed limit that is comfortable for a nervous system is 60 kilometers. We have a sense that 60 kilometers tends to bring about homeostasis, but that person has been going 120. When I even bring them down to 100 by calming frequencies that are going too fast, their nervous system may interpret that as dangerous. So they may feel depressed, sad, miserable, and then it doesn't feel good and they have a reaction, a response, and they go seeking new things. And so I talk to my clients and we're using these interfaces about this is your emotional cardio. And we're developing the discernment to understand the difference between, discomfort that's growth and discomfort that's actually, a genuine response to stress or a genuine response to something that's dangerous. And then your nervous system is giving you a clear response that you need to avoid it. But we can become avoidant of growth as well because it's uncomfortable and we don't know how to discern the difference. So one way of looking at depression, if we come from this fire metaphor and this, fire that burns and fire that cools, or warms metaphor, we can see that depression is actually an imbalance of the tenons in the front of the brain. There's different approach and avoidance behaviors associated with activation of our frontal lobe. And for those who have depression, they tend to have it inverted. So they become very avoidant and have a struggle moving forward. For anxiety, insomnia, or headache disorders, it's actually the high notes. The sopranos are singing too high or too shrill, and that's where we get our betas. So this is an under-arousal, and this is an over-arousal or unstable state. Trauma is something different. Trauma is when the rhythm section itself loses its timing or it becomes repressed in some way. And this is where we work into those dissociative disorders where individuals have kind of lost touch with the world around them and they kind of pull away. And it's because there's no timing to help them understand how to be in tune with others around them. We call this disorganized arousal. So during my undergrad, we published on a state measure of mindfulness. And this was actually where I was first introduced to this notion that our states actually are what dictate our traits. It's not so much that our traits are dictating our states, although they can as they become fixed. And the three traits that were associated with mindfulness were openness, acceptance, and curiosity. And there were 9 different measures, trait measures of this at the time. And my supervisor, Dr. Paul Fruin, said, it's really interesting that nobody has a state measure of mindfulness. So we developed a simple metric where when somebody was listening to a meditation, we would signal with a bell, and then they would click yes or no when they were actually practicing the state they were asked to practice. So those 4 states at the beginning where you're focused on something or have your mind open. And then we looked at that across different mental health categories to see, are certain meditations better for certain individuals? And we actually did find this to be true. But it really honed for me that we need to spend more time thinking about states and reflecting about the states that we're entering into and how those are affecting our mental health. Another way of looking at this is actually from an anthropologist. She wrote a paper on polyphasic or perceptual diversity and the difference between this monophasic or polyphasic mindset. So in a monophasic mindset, the worldview is based on a single state. So there's this focus on rationalism, materialism, this behaviorist paradigm, very reductionist, which actually ties into some of our DSM categories. And it's more of a sympathetic or arousal kind of purely conscious state. And one could argue that our modern world, based on these, white settler colonial ideals, is mostly focused on a monophasic mindset. And so sometimes you will hear different individuals in these more traditional areas like Peru talking about the challenges they have understanding the Western mindset and working with the Western mindset that has become so indoctrinated and kind of dictated by these reductionist belief systems often associated with DSM, whereas the polyphasic mindset values the monophasic. It sees it as part of that infinity loop, but it also views altered states, which is dropping into theta states and delta states, as valuable. So this comes with dreaming, contemplation, ecstatic and transcendental states, plus the normal waking consciousness. 90% of past societies understood this. A lot of polyphasic states even include things like love that go beyond words, where you just can't quite describe them. When you're moving into a trance, or when you're just feeling that connection or that vibe with someone. But to feel those things and to really connect in that way, you need to be able to have a parasympathetically activated state and to be more open to the subconscious. So we move into this idea of having the right tool or state for the right task. So the entire title actually of Lumpkin's paper, I think, is really important in these times, and I recommend anyone who's curious to give it a read. So perceptual diversity is polyphasic consciousness necessary for global survival, and she wrote this in 2001. And one of the main points that I took away from the paper were that cultures that are polyphasic in their approach have a flexible use of neural networks in such a way that they can more easily access a variety of perceptual processes, which says to me they're in relationship with themselves and they can choose the right state for the right task. They're not rigid or avoidant, they're flexible, they have a window of tolerance, they're creative, they're playful. These are emergent properties of a well-regulated and integrated relational state with self. Then there was another research that I came across where they had given some monks and meditators psychedelics, and then they were looking at their brain and what had changed in their brain, and they found that the DMN, which is like the hub of our sense of self, was actually more adaptive, and brain resources were allocated more easily. So we see that psychedelics help us get to these more polyphasic states. They open the mind and they open connectivity to deeper awareness. One model that I've actually been really following is Dr. Watt's model using acceptance and commitment therapy as a kind of bookending psychedelic therapies. And that's a lot of where my interest is. My interest is in how do we really help people prepare and integrate psychedelic sessions, and how can we deepen that by using brain-computer interfaces. And so I was struck by her model in this, accept, connect, and embody, this letting go, this sensing, this going deep, and then finding this pearl of wisdom and bringing that up into our conscious mind and making meaning and intention from that. And this overlaps a lot with helping people move through different brain states. But the challenge I see with that, and from a lot of the research I read, especially her paper, is that, not everybody has an easy time going there. Some people, it's their very first time even considering going into their body. And as a clinician, I know how hard that can be to get somebody to really release when they've lived their whole life in this monophasic way. To get someone to drop into a deep state, you're going to get some relaxation-induced anxiety. They've been living up in their head for a long time, or they've been living deep in themselves, and bringing them up to the surface can be really overwhelming as well. But if I start teaching them state education using brain-computer interfaces, they can slowly, like going to the gym and progressively overloading your muscles. You want to learn to lift 100 pounds. I don't want to just throw you into the 100-pound lifting session. I want to start with 1 pound and help you with your form and help you with that relationship and help you go a little bit deeper until you are comfortable going there. And when I know a client has that ability to be in relationship with their entire embodied self, I'm thinking, and I have seen, that this can really help us when we're entering into psychedelic states or altered states, or even as a substitute for those individuals where psychedelics may not be the best option. For some individuals who are more highly entropic, which I would say is more in the subconscious state, we actually need to do more stabilizing and these technologies can be used to help stabilize them before we bring them into an altered state that could then help them a little bit more. So I am a neuromeditation instructor. I work with the Neuromeditation Institute. I met Dr. Jeff Tarrant following my master's, actually during my master's, and I was just fascinated with how what he was doing was overlapping with the research I was doing, and that I was looking at for my master's the therapeutic induction of altered states of consciousness. So I was mimicking a psychedelic state, particularly that of psilocybin, and by quieting a part of the brain in the back of the head called the default mode network, which I actually have some images of here. So this is images of somebody going through a particular mindful experience, mostly a focused practice. And so on the very bottom, that bottom brain with the blue at the front, when somebody is fully attentive, we tend to be most activated in our frontal lobe, particularly on the right. And when we lose our attention, it actually shifts to a different network, and it has this pattern of connectivity that changes in the brain. And this is more of our default state. Now, remember that default state is formed basically from the ages of 10 downwards. So it's actually formed from an embodied experience that you had early on in your life. And it's kind of like those nesting dolls. And then our ego and sense of self get built upon that to take care of those younger states if we haven't had necessarily a good relationship. So where we idle can be based on a lot of factors. Some people's idling mode is not a comfortable place to go, and some people it is. Then as soon as you become aware that your mind has wandered, which requires enough of the sense of self to recognize that that has happened, we move into the insula or the salience network. Then we can start to shift our attention back to this executive network. Now, what really fascinates me about these is that, again, I read one of Shinzen Young's books following grad school, and he has these 3 core areas of mindfulness. So we have equanimity, concentration power, and sensory clarity. But those to me, as I've worked with the neuromeditations, I've come to recognize that as I'm tinkering with the default mode network, I'm really playing with equanimity, which is that one trait, acceptance. Then when I'm moving people into concentration power, which is more prefrontal control, so narrowing attention or broadening attention, focused meditation, mindfulness meditation, we're playing with elements of curiosity. Then the salience network is this openness to experience, and that ability to be open to the subconscious, the felt sense, or to the world around you, that sensory ability. So one way to kind of describe this, and this is why I have Hoffman's guy on the bike here, is that you can imagine the default mode network is like the back wheel or the bike frame itself. It gives you that foundation. And so depending on how stable that foundation is, how pumped up that wheel is, how straight the frame is, it's going to determine a lot of how comfortable your ride is. The central executive network, this curiosity, is kind of like the front wheel. And so the ability to turn the bike and determine where it is that you want the bike to go. But the salience network is that relational piece. That's that self piece. And the guy on the bike is mediated by something called the anterior cingulate, which is tied to both our default mode state, our ability to focus, and it's the relay station that determines that as we switch between our conscious mind and our subconscious mind, how we feel about it. So he is the person who discerns. He is the one who decides how hot or cold we perceive the water as being. And then that determines how we ride the bike. So if he perceives the water as being really hot, then he's likely to hold on really tight and bike really, really fast. And sometimes there's even a motor on the back of that bike that we have to work with to take that off. And sometimes it's just like, it's snowing. He doesn't believe he can do it. But nothing feels good. So he's a lazy rider, or he won't even ride the bike. He doesn't even get on his bike. He gets off the bike. And so I'm really interested in helping people understand how where you're putting your attention is actually teaching you how you're flexing your own nervous system and that relationship you have with your nervous system, and that you're not stuck in a category. You actually have a certain relationship to the world based on experiences that has happened to you in your life, and you can learn to renegotiate those. The phenotypes are interesting because there are 12, and I'm still even learning about these. And those 12 phenotypes seem to be patterns that are tied to genetic underpinnings, and that those also can determine kind of where your starting point is. So, for example, someone who's really tall versus someone who's really short. So, I'll say to my clients that are a little more high strung, like, you're just tall and you just need to learn how to duck once in a while. We don't, well, some people do punish themselves for being tall or short. We judge that. But the same is with someone who's short, to say, you just need a ladder sometimes. So I find it's really helpful when I put a cap on someone's head. I can take their EEG, we can have a conversation about what's under the hood and give them a bit of like a state education as to what aspects of self are being called forth through different forms of therapy. And then what is likely to be happening when you go into these psychedelic states that are asking you to drop your alpha bridge, essentially surrender into this deep state and enter into like a very synesthetic state where these divisions no longer exist, and how those visions that can come up, how do you work with them and integrate them based on these understandings? So psychedelics in general are understood to flatten the landscape in the mind so that we can then freely transition between states. So they open up our polyphasic capacity. And I've presented in the past and focused a little bit more on mystical experiences, but I've come to learn that even the holding on to mystical experiences and seeing those as the be all and end all and the thing that creates this connectivity can kind of come a little bit from an achievement oriented capitalistic colonial model, where we are actually thinking that this will solve the problem and that there's a pill for it. It doesn't do that. What happens is you're actually cleared to now have new relationships. And it's the question I'm asking myself, and I'm hoping others are asking themselves, is what are we doing with this clearing of our relational mind, with this opening up to connection? Where are we directing that connection? And I have been very inspired and think that one way we should be considering focusing is towards, Indigenous scholars like Dr. Yellowbird, who has this overall theory of neuro decolonization. So he's examining how a number of ancestral Indigenous approaches can be integrated with Western evidence-based science and used to heal the body and the mind from traumas of colonialization. So he's outlined, these are just a few of the areas he's outlined. And when I think about nurturing awareness, I'm definitely thinking that I'm working in the mindfulness sciences, working with collectivism about this relational piece, using technology relationally, and also neuroscience itself. And on another note, this idea of using technology relationally, I'm really motivated. I am working with groups of individuals to try to make neurofeedback more accessible to the general public, above and beyond what exists out there today, because I think there's a depth of relational aspects that can come from this that we have yet to explore. I'm really inspired by the Social Dilemma documentary, and talking about how we've been using technology based on these models that are actually downgrading humanity, these colonial models, these monophasic models, and your attention and your intention are your greatest commodity, and they need to be nurtured. And as long as we're looking at screens that are flat and things that are just taking our attention and we lose hours in, there's no relationship in that. And so I'm interested in creating technology that reflects the state of the body and gives us feedback when we've kind of lost ourselves, and then offers a relationship with self, a relationship with others, ways of playing, I want to go back for a second to the slide that I kind of jumped over quickly, back to the neuromeditation slide. So one way that we're hoping to do that is through this model. And all that Dr. Tarrant has done is just taken the science, looked at what the findings are, and created kind of scaffolding where we've put science in different categories and then offered and developed neurofeedback practices that follow the science. So, and also follow practitioners. So if I want somebody to focus, if I look at their mind and I determine that actually you're having a really hard time steering your handlebars, that seems to be where you're struggling, I may focus on training the front of the brain. If I notice that they're having a hard time just being observant, that they pedal too fast, I might actually try to slow their brain down and give them a little more again in the front of the brain. So focus is speeding the brain up, and then mindfulness is slowing the brain down. Quiet mind, the spacious awareness, is working more into the default mode network, that timing again, and getting the wheel nicely pumped up, making the frame, making sure that that's settled. Building the alpha bridge in many ways is another way of saying making sure the frame on the bike is connected and grounded and the air is pumped up. And then when we move into open heart, this is actually quite an advanced practice. And not a lot of individuals recognize that when they're offering it to clients, that to drop into the subconscious, to drop into the felt sense requires a sense of safety. And it requires a sense of relationship between these other aspects of the neural anatomy for someone to open to that. And so making sure that somebody's ready and that that fragrance of self, when that finally opens up, that that person can embrace it and not feel overwhelmed or shamed by their inability to go there. And this is helpful. It's an activating state. So we'll usually quiet the mind first so that then they can hear the silence in themselves and then feel the warmth in the nervous system that kind of emerges once you've got the guy riding the bike. You've got the wheels are nicely pumped. He doesn't have his hands clinging to the handlebars. And like Albert Hoffman, he was able to just kind of lean back on that bike ride and really take in the world around him. And when we surrender in that way and move into this gamma state, this embodied, passionate, aware state, it can be like a psychedelic, it can be like a mystical experience. Back again. Another person who's doing work in this area is Dr. Joe Chapur and the Modern Spirit Epigenetics Project. And if you're not aware of that, I recommend you have a look. And I'm really lucky to be taking a class with him right now called the River Course. And he said, it actually started last night, so I decided to throw him in my slides today. He says, the patient is the bridge, illuminating the intersection between biology, emotion, and spirituality. So with all of this considered, in order for us, and this is something I heard Dr. Yellowbird echo in one of his talks at the Omega Institute, you can find that online, I highly recommend it, is that the trick to truly bringing change is for people to be able to drop in that embodied state. So when we're clearing the ground with these medicines, you know, why are we clearing it? What relationship are we trying to encourage? And highlighting, I feel, relationship and limbic resonance is a path that I think I'm interested in nurturing, that many in the technology sector are interested in nurturing, and that returning us into these relational states is hopefully returning us to connection with ourselves, with one another, and the planet, most importantly. I'd like to leave you with a final quote. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. Thank you. You can reach me at the Neuromeditation Institute. We've got a nice quiz there. It's really easy for you to take. It's free. I'll give you a sense of where your brain is at today and give you some tips on where to go from here.
Heather, thank you very much. Fascinating information. I have a suspicion that we should all be sitting down and watching that presentation several times. It was so full of incredible information that's so relevant to what's going on these days and what people need to do as we try to, as Chris Bass has, birth the new human. Heather, we don't actually have any questions in the chat section here. So we're just going to say, I'm just going to say one more time, thank you for that and all the effort that you put into it. Such thorough research, really appreciated. So again, thank you, blessings. And now I'm going to turn it over to Mark.
Great, well, thank you, Stephen, and thank you, Heather. That was fantastic.